John Wimbles. I was born in Scotland and adopted by a Scottish mother and a father who was from Yorkshire. Yorkshiremen have a particular character in Britain. They're forthright, plain speaking, whereas my mother, being Scot, was frugal, thrifty, always careful with money and always planning ahead. So there was a good mixture there. I ultimately did my national service in the army, which was one of the best experiences of my life. I hated the thought that 2 years was to be taken out of my life and I would have nothing to show for it. In fact, I was sent one of the last 6 British soldiers to be sent to the British Army of Occupation in Austria. And as far as I was concerned, the 6 months I spent in Austria was a holiday. I taught in the British Children's School there and broadcast with British Forces Network, and ultimately was transferred to Germany when the peace treaty with Austria was signed and all foreign troops left the Austrian country. But it was my first opportunity of seeing Europe, and it was an eye-opener for me. I found the Austrians a very attractive people, a very human, and no doubt where we were occupying our particular zone in Austria, very pleased to see us, because they were not in the Russian zone. If they had been, their fate would have been something quite different. But I took away the experience, but at the back of my mind was still the hope that one day I would see Romania. And ultimately, I was able to do that in 1964. I bought a ticket, a rail ticket, London, Bucharest. And so my adventure began, and my relationship with Romania. Well, my first visit was nothing short of a disaster. And after about 4 or 5 days, and having committed some mistakes, I realized that I had to leave, otherwise my money would run out, and I said goodbye to Romania, thinking then that I would never see it again. Little did I know that I would pick up a copy of the London newspaper, The Times, and read in it a letter from a young Romanian expressing hopes that resonated within me for Romania. His hopes for Romania and mine were more or less the same. Fortunately, the letter had his address, and I wrote to him and said, I'm going to come to Romania. Can we meet?
Do you remember his name?
Yes. Paco Pamphil. And ultimately I arrived in Bucharest and was taken to his home. I can't tell you what a welcome I was given. His father was an artist, his mother was a sculptress, he himself was studying the flute, and his twin sister was studying the piano. They were a united family, but at times there would be flashes of arguments between them which really quite frightened me. On occasions they would suddenly burst out into anger and verbally fight one another, and I used to think, oh my God, there's going to be a murder here. And within minutes it had all evaporated and peace was restored. And only after a few years did I realize that this was part of the Romanian temperament, to reach peaks and to reach troughs, to go from one to the other in the flash of a minute or two. It was something I'd never come across before and still found it difficult. I remember seeing in the Boulevard Majeru the crash of two cars and the occupants of each car getting out and walking towards one another and confronting one another in the most outrageously loud argument, hurling insults at one another, and I thought any minute now they're going to start fighting, but they didn't. They said what they had to say, walked back to their cars and proceeded on. That was Romanian passion, something I have learned to appreciate, although I still find it a little bit nerve-wracking. That's the way to find out about another country. The other way is the way I adopt. Whenever I'm in a new city, I like to wander around and get lost. That way you find things you wouldn't if you had a guide taking to a museum or an art gallery. Do your own guiding, get lost, and then you will find the real Romania. That's how I found Lipscan, which fascinated me. I realized it was a place with a certain notoriety, that bad things may occur there, but seeing it and seeing how the changes were already beginning to be made gave me hope. The biggest hope of all was Ottopen Airport, which when I arrived in 1991 still bore the scars of the revolution which had happened a year previously. But each year when I went back there were more and more improvements. Most of all, the improvement was in the airline itself. Tarom had changed itself from a communist fueled organization. I will never forget the flight. My first flight to Romania was on Tarom, and I was sitting at the back of the plane in the smoking section, and coming up the aisle was the trolley, wheeled by one of the hostesses. Well, if I were to describe the hostess as built along the lines of a tank, she was driving a tank down the aisle of the plane, and suddenly she saw that I had got my leg out in the aisle, and she spied it, and she called out from where she was, "Leg!" Straight away I took my leg back and did as I was told. That was what airline stewardesses were supposed to do in those days. And when she came to serve me, the coffee tasted, to my taste, bitterly of petrol. The food that was offered was really quite inedible. 2 years later, the whole system of Tarom had been changed. The planes were no longer the old Russian planes, they were modern planes. The stewardesses were modern too. Smart, attractive, efficient, there to serve their customers. And the whole experience was thoroughly enjoyable. That was a little bit of a change that I have seen in Romania, but it's surface change. Changing the mentality of the people is something quite different. There are still procedures in Romania that are deeply embedded in the communist system, whereby if, for instance, you want to go to a museum, forget it on a Monday. Mondays, the museums are closed. Art galleries are closed. There's still this thinking that that is the day that belongs to the worker. It doesn't belong to the people who want to avail themselves of looking at an art gallery or a museum. Sorry, we're closed. There are many things that will need to be changed over the years in Romania. The changes will not be rapid. Human beings are human and don't change quickly. They get used to one particular system, and as someone described to me, if you had an apartment in Bucharest and something went wrong with the plumbing, you couldn't go to a plumber's shop. They didn't exist as such. But you may know somebody who did plumbing, and you could talk to him or her, tell them what the problem was, and come to an agreement. Well, if you fix this for me, I'll give your daughter free French lessons, or English lessons, or German lessons, or whatever my profession is. It was a barter system whereby the state organisations were pushed on one side, largely because they didn't exist, and thereby the state lost the income they would otherwise have had. You were reverting to an old system of bartering. If you give me this, I'll give you that, and no money passes hands. Well, having evolved that sort of system over the period of 50 years, you don't suddenly say to a people, hey, change. You've now got to start paying for these services. Mental thinking is not so rapid, changing from one system to another. But gradually we can hope that change will occur in Romania, and Romania will take its place alongside other countries in the world and have a brighter future. That's my constant hope. I have met the King, but very, very briefly. It was when he came to London to give a speech after he had visited Oslo in the attempt to gain Romania's admission to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He gave an excellent speech, although he was suffering very heavily from a cold on that occasion. But I was able to briefly meet him and congratulate him on the speech he had given. Previous to that, his daughter, Princess Margareta, had visited me here and looked at a collection of photographs of the royal family that I had. And we did hope to produce a book of photographs of the Romanian royal family as a matter of record, but unfortunately the photographs we selected were lost in the post and nothing ever came of it.
Wow.
That is the total extent of my meetings with the royal family. I've always kept a little bit back from going into the royal circle. I'm a little bit frightened that it might alter my perception. I'd like to keep my perception particularly unambiguous. I don't want to take sides, but to make my own mind and make my own judgment from afar. Distance lends enchantment, I know, but nearness blunts your sensibilities a bit. So I don't know the royal family at all, but I do admire what they represent, and in particular what King Michael represents: respectability, a position of honour above and apart from day-to-day politics. There's a gentleman in Arad who is a fervent monarchist and used to produce a new paper called Coroana de Oțel. I don't know whether it still goes. I've lost contact with him now, but that was a very reassuring thing for me to know that there were little pockets of royal supporters in Romania. At times I used to think, well, nobody is interested. The people I spoke to in Bucharest sometimes amazed me by what they knew about the royal family.
Not much.
And, well, they did know more than I gave them credit for. And that was done largely through family. Their parents and their grandparents told them stories of older members of the royal family, so they had a basis. And in any case, they were, I think, intellectually bound to see the monarchy as an alternative for the drab greyness of what the Communist Party had offered them, a succession of non-entities, of cardboard figures who meant nothing to them, who appeared to have no passion in them. Gheorghiu Dej, Ceausescu, Ana Pauca, these were people who were almost faceless, as though they had no blood in their veins. That certainly couldn't be said of members of the royal family. And one of the great moments of joy for me was to learn that Princess Ileana was able to return to Romania, aged though she was and not in good health, but to go back to Bran, where she had spent so many happy years of her life and which had been left to her by Queen Mary in her. I meet Romanians, and one young man, one day in the summer, I was sitting having a cigarette, and he looked at my bag and said, "You're from Romania?" I said, "No." And we got talking. He was very interested in history and a very intelligent young man. And he came and sat by me, and I always take this book out with me to try to understand more of it, because it's in Romanian, so a lot of it is unintelligible to me. And instantly this young man said, "Oh, King Michael, he's a very rich man." I said, "Why do you say that?" He said, "It's in our books, in our history. When he left the country, he took all our gold, all Romania's gold reserves." What a nonsense. When I said to him, he lived in England for a period of time not far from here and set up a chicken farm. That's how desperate he was to make an income, to cover his expenses. Well, of course, this young man didn't believe it. He has based his theory on 50 years of communist history, which has constantly denigrated everything that the royal family did do in Romania. That's what you're up against. You're up against 50 years of constant drip, drip, drip. The monarchy was rubbish. Socialism is our future. And look at the future it turned out to be. A tragedy. About Princess Margareta. Apparently, they were trying to persuade Queen Anne to stop smoking. And it was a very, very tough trial for the Queen to give up a lifelong habit. Subsequently, Princess Margareta discovered that members of the staff at the Elisabeta Palace were buying cigarettes for the Queen. So she got the staff together and said, "If you continue to do this, I will have to let you go." Well, of course, it was successful. The Queen did stop smoking, but unfortunately it badly affected her health, with the results we all know now. But there you are. There's my cigarette. I had my first one in 1941, and I shall keep going until they put me 6 feet under.
5.5.
irrespective of the expense.
5.5.
Sorry?
5.5.
I was 6. I was 6 when I had my first cigarette. This, unfortunately, is a truism about drugs. There's no doubt about it. Nicotine is a drug. I admit it. I'm a drug addict. But I think it's partially better to be a nicotine addict than to be an alcoholic addict. Talking about King Michael's experience in exile, imagine somebody who had been through his life, having become king at the age of 6, and then being chucked off the throne by his own father and brought up by his father, who, thinking that he was giving them the best sort of education by putting a group of fellow students alongside him from different ethnic backgrounds in Romania, that he was preparing his son to be a future king of Romania. But there was one ethnic void among the students in King Michael's school. There wasn't one Jew, not one. So it was lopsided. And that was part of the character of King Carol II. He was a chameleon. He had the best of intentions, but the intentions often became forgotten in his own personal vanity for uniforms and for breaking the law by sending money abroad, which was strictly illegal for Romanians in the 1930s. So the king eventually came to the throne in 1940 in circumstances that were not good. He was virtually the prisoner of General Antonescu, later to become Marshal. But one good thing that Antonescu did and pushed for strongly was the return of Queen Helen. She returned to Romania amid loud acclamations from the population, who saw in her a kind of cleansing agent. It was out with Madame Lupescu and her camarilla of self-seeking relatives and friends, and bringing in a woman whose honesty and whose incorruptibility was self-evident. It was she who, during the war, urged King Michael to make some protest about the pogroms directed against the Jewish population, saying to her son, "You don't want to be known in history as the man who oversaw the fate of the Jewish population of Romania." Well, she was steadfast throughout his life. Like him, she felt that she was a prisoner, that whatever she did was watched and reported on, particularly after 1945, when Petru Groza became Prime Minister and the Russians were virtually ruling the country and at the same time robbing it of its assets. She was a woman of real fortitude, and I doubt whether King Michael could have survived as well as he did if he did not have his mother's support during those years. She went through the motions. She did visits to hospitals and orphanages, knowing all the time that whatever she said that might be derogatory to the Russians or to the communists would be reported. In fact, she was quite used to that sort of thing. When she was in Bucharest in 1931, there are in the files of the National Archives the reports of people who were set to spy on her. And each day they would report, oh yes, the princess left so-and-so, went to see her dentist. At such and such a time, Prince William of Sweden arrived, and at such and such a time, Monsieur so-and-so came. Every step she took was watched and reported.
Sorry to interrupt, John. Can you emphasize more? Can you emphasize more on how you came about to see the archives?
Yes,
Please.
That's
really interesting.
That was a wonderful opportunity for me.
Okay, go ahead.
I mentioned to Paco Pamphil that I was interested in looking at the archives in Bucharest because I had read a biography of Queen Mary, which had been written some years previously, and the author mentioned that she had had access to archives in Bucharest. And this surprised me, because to my mind,
What year was that?
1985, I think, Hanna Pakula's book was written. To my mind, everything to do with the royal family had been destroyed. Then to read Hanna Pakula's book and see that the archives still had a wealth of material about the royal family came as a surprise. So I was introduced to the archive authorities in Bucharest, and it was like entering Aladdin's cave. There, indexed, were dossiers about every member of the royal family, including Queen Mary's diaries, including her correspondence with her mother, with her sisters, and with her children. And knowing how British I am and my ignorance of foreign languages, I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to understand anything of this. Everything was in English. So then I started scribbling away, realizing that time was short, but I was so anxious to get as much information as I could. And then the idea came into my head, well, I'm not going to be able to do it all now. I'll come back another year. And that's precisely what I did. And I was fortunate then to meet somebody at the University of Bucharest who similarly was interested in the Royal Archives. And with his cooperation, he copied the correspondence in the archives and posted it to me in Britain. Hence, I've got a dozen bound volumes of the royal correspondence of Queen Mary with her sisters and with her mother, which gave me an intimate insight into the lives of the old royal family.
Do you remember that name?
Sorry?
Do you remember that name? Who helped you?
Yes. Mihai Alin Pavel, who has since done a lot of work on the genealogies published by Mihail Sturza. And again, you know, I had met Mihail Sturza's mother, Princess Ileana, who lived in an apartment overlooking the, I think you call it the Park of the Youth, Tineretului, in Bucharest.
Oh yeah.
And she kept au fait with all the latest royal gossip from Western Europe. She could tell me things I didn't know. And she was a fount of information about the royal family of the past. A wonderful old lady who unfortunately died a few years ago, but her memory was as bright as a button, and it was a delight to meet her. Like most people, I thought that the old princely families had been eradicated in Romania in much the same way as happened in Russia. It wasn't true. They had been devalued. They had been dropped down in society, and they had been working at ordinary jobs like you or me, but they had survived, and they had survived with their memories and were able to pass on those memories to their children and to their grandchildren. And that's how so many people I met in the little circle of people I knew were really knowledgeable about the royal family and anxious to find out even more. And now that they were able to look at the archives, another world opened up to them too. If the monarchy were restored in Romania, it would not have the same powers that, for instance, King Carol I and King Ferdinand had. Particularly King Ferdinand under the 1923 constitution gave too many powers to the king, and as we saw when King Carol II came to the throne, they were badly misused by a man who, as far as statecraft was concerned, was an ignoramus. What I see, if the monarchy were established, is a system which they have in, for instance, Denmark or Norway or Sweden. The king and the royal family are the representatives of the Romanian people on the world stage and on the Romanian stage. They set a standard of conduct for the rest of the people. Whether the people willingly follow in their footsteps, that's up to the people themselves. That's their choice. But at least if you have a figurehead who is above suspicion and above politics, and who, at the time of crisis or emergency, can get the leaders of the political parties to come to the palace and thrash out in front of him their problems, with the constant reminder which the sovereign will always tell them, gentlemen, ladies, think first of all of the country, not of your own political ambitions, but of the country. That, I think, is the best recommendation for a restoration of monarchy to Romania. And it would be a beacon for other countries in the region too. Because let's face it, if King Simeon had not made the mistake of entering the political arena and becoming Prime Minister of Bulgaria, his fate when he returned to Bulgaria might have been a little bit different. Whatever happens, the king must not mix in politics. That's for the politicians. Initially, it was an undeveloped country. King Carol I came to Romania. Communist books will tell you he came with nothing except his medals in his boot. In other words, he had got no money, and if he did get money, it was the new Romanian state that would give it to him. Now, this wasn't true. As a Prince of Hohenzollern, he had an annual allotment of 50,000 gold francs per annum, and that continued throughout his life in Romania. In 1883, I think it was, after the dissolution of the monasteries in Romania, the royal domains were set up, and King Carol was allotted under the royal domains certain properties throughout Moldavia and Wallachia. He brought to those domains some of the procedures that were operative in the west of Europe, and he made them paying concerns and made them run at a profit along lines that were admittedly rather German, but nonetheless they were successful. At the same time, he was helped by his wife, Queen Elizabeth, better known as Carmen Silva, who, through her writings, made Romania's name well known throughout Europe, throughout the literary world. In fact, one of her products was crowned by the French Academy. She was the advertiser, sometimes rather flamboyant, sometimes rather awkward, and sometimes rather embarrassing, but a well-intentioned woman whose heart was fully committed to the welfare and the prosperity of Romania. Fortunately, both King Carol and Queen Elizabeth were succeeded by two figures who, in their turn, played their part in the development of the greater Romania. King Ferdinand, though German-born, German-trained, stayed loyal to the Romanian constitution and loyal to Romania's entry into the First World War on the side of the Entente. It is sometimes forgotten that among the vast territories brought back within Romania's borders, there were many Hungarians. But at least King Ferdinand could say to them, yes, maybe you are Magyar, but I too have Hungarian blood in my veins. He was not only Ferdinand the Loyal, he was Ferdinand the Unifier, and he was ably assisted by another woman, Regina Maria, who again certainly was a flamboyant woman, but she spread the name of Romania worldwide and never ceased to work in its interests. On one occasion she complained to a British diplomat in Bucharest, "Oh, why is it you're always talking about Bulgaria and you never talk about my country?" And don't forget, when the Germans occupied Bucharest in 1916-1917 and forced the Allied missions to be expelled from Romania, King Ferdinand and Queen Mary went down to the railway station to bid farewell to the British and the French and the Italians and the Russians. And as the train drew out, Queen Mary shouted out to one of the members of the British delegation, "Don't forget, I'm a British princess." In other words, I'm never going to give in. We'll fight on, no matter what happens. And within 2 years, she and King Ferdinand were back in Bucharest, presiding over a vastly enlarged country. The fact that a country of such diverse assets, of oil, endless forests, rivers, rich soil, and those assets were wasted, was not due to them, but towards their profligate son, King Carol II. King Michael, when he came to the throne, had no powers whatsoever, and to blame him for as some of the communists have said, caving in to the Russians, is a travesty of the truth. Which would the Romanians have preferred? To have continued fighting alongside the Germans against the invading Russian armies, and then to have suffered the same fate that Budapest suffered when the Russians finally entered Hungary? What would they have done to Bucharest? Levelled it to the ground. No matter what King Michael tried to do, ably assisted by Prince Pardubice, the Allies were not willing to render the assistance to King Michael that he asked for. The result was he stayed, hoping against hope that he would be able to stave off the ultimate subjugation of Romania to communist rule and Soviet rule as well. Don't forget, there was talk in the 1950s that it was the intention of the Soviets to wipe Romania from the face of Europe and to split it up among neighbouring countries, Russia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria. The fact that there was a sea change following the death of Stalin, and those who had been willing faithfully to follow the Stalinist line suddenly found themselves in a precarious position. Perhaps it was a happy fate that meant that Gheorghe Dej died in 1965 and was followed by somebody who was at least a true Romanian-born Romanian leader. As we know, Ceausescu played his cards very adroitly, trying to persuade the West that he was the bad boy among the Soviet satellites and that he would plough his own policy in defiance of Moscow. In actual fact, he did nothing of the sort, and it's little wonder that his fate was such as it was in the disgraceful circumstances which occurred after the military tribunal in 1990. I think it is a question of royal relationships which these days are less important than they were 100 years ago. When the First World War occurred, you had the alarming situation of three cousins representing the three principal powers in Europe: the Tsar, the Kaiser, and here the King. All of them first cousins. That relationship no longer exists as far as Europe is concerned. But the Queen, our Queen, being Queen of the United Kingdom, has a certain interest in showing that monarchy can work, and she is willing to give whatever support she can to other of her relatives who might be in need of help. When King Michael came to the West in 1948, she apparently offered him a residence in Britain, but he decided, along with his wife, that he would feel more comfortable in Switzerland and went to live there instead. But he was a constant visitor to Britain, and his eldest daughter, Crown Princess Margareta, in fact went to Edinburgh University to study there and eventually found employment with a United Nations organization. So it's not surprising that family being family, and I realise this is something Romanians appreciate. To you, family is an important unit, and maintaining relations with your relatives is something that is important even today. My great sorrow is that my own country never recognised King Michael's role in 1944 in overturning Antonescu and turning the Romanian army into an ally of the Russian army and continuing the war against the Germans. The Russians were so appreciative, they awarded King Michael their highest honour, the Order of Victory. The Americans awarded him the Legion of Merit. What did my country do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Except when he came to the Queen's wedding in 1947, they said to him, "Oh, you may wear the Order of the Royal Victorian Order, which had been given to him in 1938 and had been withdrawn in 1941 when we declared war on Romania." That was the sum total of the recognition that my country did not give to King Michael, and that makes me feel deeply ashamed. It's something that they have never rectified and never acknowledged. So relationships are still important as far as the royal family is concerned, but it's within the constraints in which the Queen always works. If, for instance, she were to openly acknowledge her support for King Michael, the government of the day here in Britain say, "Well, just a minute, ma'am, we're in good relations with Romania, we don't want to upset their government, we would rather you didn't say this." So she remained silent. Yes, this question of the wealth with which King Michael absconded from Romania in 1948. Don't forget, after he had signed the deed of abdication at the Elizabeta Palace in Bucharest, he returned immediately to Peleș Castle in Sinaia. There he was confronted with a host of officials who had been sent by the government to ensure that whatever he packed to take away was his personal property and not what they considered to be the property of the state. There was no question of King Michael being able to put his hands on vast amounts of currency or gold. What he did was load, I think, 3 jeeps that had been given to him, one by the Russians and I think another one by the Americans, which I believe he still possesses. These were the kind of things that were important to him. Maybe 1 or 2 family albums, but I know that Queen Helen tried to pack 1 or 2 items which had been given to her as wedding gifts in 1921 and which were her personal property, and she was not allowed to take them. More importantly, a few days afterwards, Princess Elisabeta and Princess Ileana left the country by train, and Princess Elisabeta had been assured by some of her friends in the Romanian government that she could take her jewellery collection with her. When the train approached the Hungarian border, customs officials boarded the train, went through her luggage and found it stuffed with jewellery. They confiscated all except 12 pieces which they allowed her to take. Subsequently, a very astute young Romanian tracked down those items of jewellery and discovered that they had been presented to visiting communist delegations in Romania in the years following the withdrawal of the Romanian royal family. If the king had left with a fortune of money or assets, why is it that he felt impelled to set up a chicken farm in Britain, not only selling chickens but selling flowers? He was hard pressed for money until he found a job with the Lear aviation company, and even then things were tight and remained so for the rest of his life. One of the significant things about this is that his mother, who used to own a property in Italy, eventually ran into financial problems and had to sell it up and ended her life in an apartment in Switzerland. If he had had shoals of money, that would never have happened to his mother. But that's history. And it's a sad commentary that now, due to the pressure from the European Union, the Romanian government has restored certain properties to King Michael, along with an allotment of money as compensation for what was unfairly, unlawfully and unjustly taken away from him in 1948. I remember as a young child, sometimes a gypsy lady would knock on our back door and my mother would answer it, and the gypsy woman was trying to sell clothes pegs. Well, it was notorious among housewives in Britain that if you refused to buy anything from a gypsy, they would put a curse on you. Well, of course, that sort of thing, we dismiss it as, well, it's ridiculous. How can a gypsy woman put a curse on me? But it was a powerful thing among housewives, and sometimes they fell for it and they would buy a few pegs. I have seen gypsies in Romania and in Albania, and I've seen many of them here. When I go shopping, it's likely that a group of 3 ladies will approach me, and I know straight away that they are gypsies, because their skirts trail down to the floor, they've got floral patterns on, they've got lots of gold necklaces, gold bangles, gold earrings, and as they approach me, they say, "You won't buy? You won't buy?" I say, "No, sorry, no." And I know very well that this gold ring, which they say is genuine, if I took it off the next day, there would be a green band round my finger. It isn't gold, it's false gold. So a gypsy, by his very nature, is looking for the main chance, for the opportunity. He knows no law. Law does not exist to the gypsy. He is a free agent. If that's the case, let the gypsy find his own country and rule himself, which he never will. He'll kill one another. This is characteristic of gypsies worldwide. They're the same in Britain, basically, as they are in Romania, and you will never tame them. You will never put them in a block of apartments and say, right, that's where you live, observe the rules. They won't. They'd probably have a fire in the middle of the floor. As you say, they have their own customs, developed over hundreds of years, and they can't be weaned away from them. They really can't. It's a pity, but there you are. I mean, there are many, you see many aspects of gypsy life in Spain, which, you know, to a certain extent is acceptable. You love their dance, you love their song, you love their guitars, but once they've had a drink or two, they become unmanageable. No, it's a shame. There are many things that are admirable about gypsies, but many things that people like you and I find unable to accept. You know, if for instance this apartment block, if we suddenly discovered that a gypsy family was going to move in, we'd be up in arms about it. It just would not happen. And then, of course, we would lay ourselves open to, oh, well, you're racially prejudiced. Well, I'm not prejudiced against the race, I'm prejudiced against the habits.
Să uiți suferi